Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback Podcast. Today, I am really happy and excited to have on the show Phil Parker, who is the creator and founder of the Lightning process. So many of you guys would have heard of this process. I've actually had numerous practitioners actually from the Lightning process who have got themselves better and are now, spreading the word on the podcast. So, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think everyone's really excited to hear, your story, but also just to answer some questions. So, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for inviting me to come on the show. It's always, I'm really pleased to be here. I've done a couple of podcasts recently, and what we've been looking at is talking to people who are really interested in this whole recovery, because I've been working in this field for decades, literally decades. I think 1980 something when I started, and back then the idea that chronic fatigue and all these kind of things were irrecoverable was absolutely set in stone. So to hear other people kind of shouting from the rooftops that this is, recovery is a possible outcome is so refreshing. It's really nice to be here.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's exciting to have you on, and just you starting such a movement as you did. I'd really like to hear about kind of how you got to that point. Because I imagine you come on, you answer a lot of questions about your program, but what was your story before the Lightning process?
It's quite a long story, so if that's okay. So first of all, behind me, you can probably see guitars, because my original dream was to be a rock guitarist. That's really what I wanted to do. But my mum and dad said, you've got to get a proper job as well. So I trained to be an osteopath, which was good. I enjoyed it. But I kept both the gigs going. So I was in London training as an osteopath in the 80s and performing and doing well. And then in 1985, I think it was 85. I was 20. It's a beautiful August day. The sun was shining. I was in the garden helping my friend move this caravan that got stuck, and we were rocking this caravan that was stuck in a rut, and they were at the front and I was at the back. And I pushed my hands through the glass, which shattered. They kept on rocking backwards and forwards, and I'd severed my left hand at the wrist. So all the muscles and particularly the nerves had been absolutely cut. Not the blood vessels. Luckily, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Now, because I was an osteopath, I knew what I'd done. I knew the significance of this injury, which was if your nerves are severed, then any signal coming down from your brain to the bit beyond where the cut is just doesn't get through. So they rushed me to hospital, and I said to the surgeons, how soon before I can play the guitar? And they said, oh, you'll never be able to play the guitar again. I was like, okay. So I was 20, and I was like, I'll have a second opinion on that, please. So the second guy came in and had a look, and he said, good news, the first guy was absolutely correct. You will never move your fingers again. You'll be left with a useless claw. And according to the textbooks, they were completely right. This is what happens when you cut this particular nerve, which is called the ulnar nerve or the musician's nerve, because it controls the fine movements of your fingers. When that's done, when that's cut, it generally doesn't return. And you are left with this claw. And I thought, it just can't be right. It can't be. A, I really need my hands to be an osteopath and be a guitar player. And secondly, well, if lizards can regrow tails, I mean, surely there's got to be a way around this. It's got to be. So I kept on asking. Everybody said, look, I'm really sorry. These things don't recover. And I kept on asking. Eventually I found someone who was a physio who worked with a mind-body connection. He said, I think you've got a chance of recovering. And I was like, yes, okay, I think you're right. I'm going to listen to what you say and ignore all the other experts. You can tell what a contrary 20-year-old I was. And off we went, doing lots of exercises, mental training, taking nutrition, stretching, everything we could possibly do. And I also looked at other people who had recovered from hand damage. And there was one guy called Django Reinhardt, very famous jazz guitarist from the 1920s and 30s in France, who had burnt his hand so badly he was only left with two fingers that functioned, and he developed a whole new kind of style of guitar playing. I was like, okay, well, if he can do that, that's useful to know. And 6 months, took 6 months, but I remember it was 6 months later. So what was happening? was I'd send a message down to my hand going move, and it just wouldn't move, which is quite a weird thing. And then I was sitting in a lecture, and I was just checking it out, like, is this, hoping this would at some point switch back on. And I got the tiniest little glimmer of movement in my finger, which had been absent for 6 months. And I was like, yes, this tells me something has changed, something has connected up, something is improving. And that really assisted me to kind of go, right, okay, this is not only do I think it's doable, it is doable. And with time I recovered. I ended up playing guitar. I even played guitar with Eric Clapton, but that's another story. Released singles and albums, and and pursued that. But at the same time, it kind of steered me down this course of, right, well, that's interesting. What, first of all, the mind-body connection, how those two things are interrelated. And I was an osteopath, so I was very aware of physical stuff in the body. We did anatomy, physiology, pathology, all that stuff. I retrained in NLP, hypnotherapy, coaching, psychotherapy, to look at the kind of emotional side of stuff, and I put all that together. And I was particularly interested in the conversations that happen between a client and a doctor, where the doctor says you can't recover, and what is the consequence of those kind of statements. Because for me, it would have been very easy to kind of go, when you hear 20 experts going, you will never recover, to kind of go, okay, it won't then. And then thinking, well, what made me keep on asking, because most people at that point, it's just to, go home. And I think for me, it was because it was so important, and also, well, I've always had this kind of way of thinking, which is like, I'm quite happy to accept people's opinions, but I really want to explore whether they're accurate or not first, as much as I can. So fast forward, I'm in the 80s, I'm now qualified, and people come to see me. This is the second part of the story. People come to see me with a whole range of issues, but particularly because I have this set of skills. I'm physical health with osteopathy and all that kind of stuff, but also I've got these kind of psychological, emotional skills. So I put them together. So people would send me their most difficult clients. They go, I can't get on with this. I can't help you. Go and see Phil. So I'd end up with people who by definition have been stuck for a long time. And one of the groups of people that came to see me were people with ME and chronic fatigue. And I tried all my brilliant techniques on them, and they didn't work. Nothing worked. And what I found was people with those issues would improve and then flatten, crash. It was really difficult to sustain change. And so actually I got to a point in a kind of early 90s where somebody rang up and said, can you help me because I've got ME or chronic fatigue? I'd say, really, don't waste your money, because I haven't found the skills I've got are successful. But I kept on working with people who were stuck with other conditions, and some of them I found got really good change and some didn't. And I thought, what do we do with the people who aren't making change? I could throw them back into the world of, the rotating door, the revolving door, of seeing another clinician, another technique, or maybe I could do some research. So I did some research on, is there anything we can learn about people who really want to get well, but seem to not be able to get the change they want, whereas other people do? So, and that's where the lightning process really began, was identifying, is there something we're missing here? Are we not seeing something? Is there a bit we need to work on? And the lightning process really came from that study into, how do we help people to become unstuck? What needs to happen? What can we do? What skills might be useful in teaching them? And so I started to get some really good success with the lightning process. And then somebody came along with ME and said, can you use the lightning process with ME? And I went, I don't really want to take your case on, because I know how difficult it is to work with this condition, and my stats are quite good. If I take you on, it's probably not going to work out that well, and then the lightning process won't look too good. But they said, look, I won't tell anyone if it doesn't work, please, please, please. I was like, okay, well, let's have a go. Let's just see. And really, to my surprise, and this sounds strange when you fast forward now to where if somebody has ME or chronic fatigue, it's fairly predictable if they use the lightning process, they're going to get pretty good results. But at that time, we didn't know that. So to my surprise, they got well. And I was like, oh, that won't last. That was my experience of ME. And it did last for months and months and months and months. And they sent some friends, and the same thing happened. And so we started to see people getting well from something which I'd always considered to be really quite tough to recover from recovering. So that's kind of where the lightning process began. It didn't actually begin with ME at all. It began with other conditions. And this is what we find people, get in contact and say, I've got this, I've got Parkinson's, or I've got MS, multiple sclerosis, or I've got this. Can you work with us? And we'll say, we have no idea. We've never worked with that before, but we can have a look and see what we can do. So yeah, that in a very long answer to your very short question is part of the journey that I went through. So it started in 1985 and the lightning press was invented in 1999.
No, I think you shortened it quite well. So I have had some people on the podcast where I ask them a question and then it's like 40 minutes later and I'm asking my second question. Not to say that's bad either, but just for those who don't know and who aren't aware, could you talk us through what the lightning process actually is? I know it's like a 3-day process in general, from what I understand, but what is it that can take someone who is bedbound or, not able to live their normal life to recovery? What is it specifically?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not a 3-day program. Okay. Often people think it is, and that's a misunderstanding. First of all, it starts with a 5-hour audio program that you listen to at home. And the purpose of that is to start that conversation about, is it possible to change a physical condition like ME, chronic fatigue, multiple sclerosis, some of the other things I mentioned, using the link between our mind, brain, and body. And that's a really important starting point, because many people, as soon as they hear the word mind, in the word mind-body connection, they go, what you're saying, it's all in my mind. We go, no, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is this is a physical illness that can be affected by your neurology. And one of the easiest ways to get in touch and change your neurology is changing the way you use it, the way you think, what you're focusing. And so we talk about a lot of the research into that, and there's loads and loads of research. If anybody says to you, there is no connection between the mind and body, they really have not read the wealth of research that's out there that says absolutely, all the placebo studies, and there's so much stuff I could talk about, and I might do it at some point on this little conversation. But we talk about that. So there's 5 hours of that, why the lightning process might work, giving you some tools, looking at the importance of language, because language is another thing that's really focused on the lightning process. The words that we have, and again, we talk about the research into this, that's all research-based. The words we have, so for instance, if there's some nice research, some guys in Germany called Retraining, where if you put someone in a scanner where you scan the activity of the brain, so an fMRI scanner, a functional MRI scanner, so you see the blood flow and the activity of the brain, and you give them a set of playing cards, and the playing cards, instead of having hearts and clubs on them, have words. And some of the words are to do with grocery shopping, and some of the words are to do with pain. So they mix them up, pass them over to you, and you read them. If you read a grocery word like avocado or banana, nothing particularly happens. But if you read a word that says something to do with pain, you'll see a lighting up of the pain processing centers of the brain. And so that shows us that, and that's been reproduced a number of times, that words have a deep effect. So the words of pain or tiredness or fatigue will equally have an effect on our neurophysiology. So lightning process, the first part is that audio where you engage with that, have a look at that, give you some exercise, give you a sense of, does this sound like makes sense to me? Because the next bit, the 3-day seminar, you need to kind of be ready to kind of go, right, I've got my head in this, right, this makes sense to me. If somebody listens to the audio and goes, yeah, that sounds like nonsense, then there's probably not much point in them moving forward into the lightning process, because the lightning process seminar is where they're going to apply those tools to make change. So fundamentally, what they'll learn on that is on those 3 days. So on day 1, we teach them, you have to be aware of when you are stimulating neural pathways that are going to make trouble for your physiology. So one of the pathways we'll look at is the stress pathway, or we call it the physical emergency response, or the flight and fight pathway, which is when we activate that, it has direct, long-lasting consequences on our immune system, our blood sugar levels, our thyroid hormones, our digestion, our sleep, and so on, right? That are not good, particularly when they're activated for long term. So we need to be aware when we're stimulating those. And then what we need to do, once we're aware of that, is to make some choices so we can steer our brain in a new direction that triggers different pathways that are more healthy. So we learn that on the first day. Then we say, look, here's some tools to to do that, to be aware of it and to switch. And then off you go, come back the next day, tell us how you've gone. So the next day they come back, they say, look, I've achieved this, but I'm stuck here. And then we support them in working out how to get unstuck with those things they haven't made change on. And we give them some more skills. And then the same thing happens on the third day. And then after those 3 days, there's a third part, which is now you've got to go out into the big old world and use these new ideas and new ways of thinking and speaking. And the world isn't very supportive of that. So there's a series of support hours that we do with people after the seminar to help them to put it into practice, and that continues afterwards. And there's loads of free audios and stuff they can do, because we know that putting this stuff into practice is quite tough. It's unusual to think differently, to use your brain differently. It's unfamiliar, and it's all really based around the concept of neuroplasticity, which I'm sure your viewers have heard many times. Yeah. Basically the idea that the more you use a particular pathway, the stronger it becomes. Mm-hmm. And if you've been using pathways unwittingly that have set up bad physiological cycles where your body gets into stress, or you find yourself naturally thinking about your symptoms a lot, then if you keep doing that a lot, it becomes very strong. But the good news is, if you can shift that and switch into good pathways, they will become strong with practice, because, and this is a key thing, we always tell people, neuroplasticity just is a thing, like gravity is. It's a thing that occurs, and it's always on. It's always watching. It's always paying attention. It's always responding to use. So if you use your brain in a good, healthy way, those pathways will absolutely become stronger.
Yeah, I think anyone who's listened to this will know that I fully believe in the process of brain retraining. Whilst I haven't, I'm kind of going through like and we didn't talk about this before, but like I've tried different brain retraining, and I think as I've gone through different processes, I've taken to it more and more. I've always understood the concept, and I've always realized that it makes total sense. And if I was able to apply it in the right way, it would work quicker for me. It's just the application for me hasn't quite been as straightforward. And so I've ended up, the way I'm kind of, it's a bit of a strange process that I've been going through. I've started to very, very gradually get back into exercise over the course of the last 14 to 15 months. And I think you talked about it earlier about getting that evidence when you had your severed hand, and you could see that little bit of, and that was the evidence. That was all your brain needed then. And through doing this exercise with this trainer that I talked about, and doing other things that I've been working on, my sleep and breath work and stuff, I've started to get little bits of evidence that my body can improve and it can get a little bit stronger. There will be a lot of crashes and everything. And I'm really building that belief gradually that recovery is not, I've talked about it on the podcast, it's not just possible, it's inevitable, and it's something that's coming, but it's going to take longer. So I feel like I'm kind of like going the long way round, and your process offers people who are good at the application of it like a shortcut if they're good. Sorry, I'm going with a long description now. I feel like there's quite a lot of people similar to me who kind of sit in the middle. You might get people who just immediately don't take to it. They don't believe it, so they walk away. They're almost easy to deal with, I imagine, for you, because they're just like, right, they're not a good fit. And then you get the other people that, I've had on the podcast actually, that come and they have 3 days and they have this amazing shift in 3 days that they can take into the real world. And then I think you get these other people that are maybe sitting in the middle they totally get it and they see other people recover, but they, through a number of different reasons, aren't able to apply it within their life. What do you think's like the biggest obstacle for these guys? For me, it was because visualization was like a big part of it. I don't know if that is within the lightning process, and being able to tap into feelings and visualize in the future, I just wasn't able to do. So that was the big obstacle for me. And so I just eventually just kind of gave up a little bit. So what would you say you see is like the biggest obstacle for people kind of sitting in that middle camp? If you indeed do agree with me that there is this kind of middle camp.
I think there is a middle camp, but it's not that big. That's the interesting thing.
Okay.
So we did a study of 1,205, I think, people. And we asked them, was this an appropriate approach for your needs? And out of that 1,200 people, 3 people went no. So that's tiny. The rest of them said, it was fabulous. I think I can't remember the stats, but something like 85% of people said it was amazing. And some people said, it was really good, but I need to apply myself to it more. So the tools are appropriate. I've got to find my way through it. And that's, I think, one of the big values of the Lightning process is a lot of the other programs that have kind of come out of it, derived from it. A lot of them are video based, whereas the Lightning process is one-to-one or in a group, but face-to-face, so that you can go, I don't know how to do this. And you go, right, okay, let's take you through it. And because Lightning process practitioners are not just Lightning process practitioners, they're really skilled therapists and coaches, they can go, right, okay, let's find a way for you. And so what we usually find, if people go, I can't, let's say, visualize, you go, okay, let's find a different way to do that. So visualization is one of the ways of re-stimulating pathways. But for some people, that's not the way to do it. They need to listen to music, they need to dance, they need to, but it's about within the context of, okay, how do I find a way to step out of those pathways? Because you're clearly stepping into the pathways that are not healthy. So you are able to access pathways that are not useful. The question then is, right, well, how do we then hack in or help you hack into your system so you can kind of go, right, I'm going to stop doing that and move into a different one. So it's about finding that way. And, people find lots of different ways to do it. But when you've got that kind of evidence, like you're talking about for something like Lightning process, and you go, I can feel something, or I can sense this is different, or my body feels different, or I can walk further. You get that evidence. You're like, okay, this is working for me. I'm making this work for me. So it's really about finding where is the stuckness. And what's interesting is that stuckness is usually showing up everywhere else. And it will be getting in the way of everything else you do. And so identifying it and finding ways around it will be really useful. So let's say you're an athlete and you're currently kind of doing some kind of personal training thing. There's loads of research in athletics and tennis particularly, where visualizing your serve rather than doing it improves your serve as much as serving. So the more you can apply that. So if you can, when you're doing your PT, your personal training, you can really connect with what it feels like to be healthy when you're doing it. That will improve your performance. And again, there's loads of research into that. So in terms of your question was, what gets in the way of people? It's different for different people, but that's what you need to identify. It's like, where is this not fitting for you? And then carefully and together, collaboratively going, okay, well, how do we get around this? How do we find a way through this? Because there's got to be a way through it.
I think the other thing for me was, and I felt a lot of guilt around this, was I would trying to, because I still work and, I told you I'm running a business, to stop and do like try and stop myself in the middle of the day and incorporate all of this new stuff I had to do. I found it quite overwhelming. And then also it played into, if I don't do this perfectly, I'm not going to recover. And I think I spoke to you about another program before, Primal Trust, which talked a lot about like perfectionism and how that's actually, the antithesis of what you need. You need to, but I find that really difficult. Oddly enough, I'm not a perfectionist in parts of my life where it'd be good to be a perfectionist, just in chronic health recovery. But yeah, you see that quite a lot where people find it difficult. They get
we don't, because yes and no. First of all, we see perfectionism a lot. It's a massive issue in lots of people, and recognizing that one of the cornerstones of the Lightning process is it has to be done kindly. It's central and central to the Lightning process is compassionate self-regard. So part of the Lightning process is to become an inner coach. So you start talking to yourself, but it's really, really important how you do that. So if you kind of have conversations like, oh, come on, Phil, get on with it. That is not coaching. That is beating yourself up. Or that's not good enough. That's not coaching. And all those things, coming back to what we were talking about, the stress response, increase the amount of tension and stress within your body. There's a really interesting bit of research where they look at people, because we know two people experiencing the same moment will have different experiences. You imagine two people on a roller coaster, one who loves it and one doesn't. They'll have very different experiences of the roller coaster. If we come into something in our world and we experience it as unexpected, but we think, I have the resources within me to deal with this, I'll find a way through this, and we will approach it like an opportunity or a challenge, and our blood pressure will actually slightly go down. Somebody standing next to us who experiences it as this, I don't have the resources to deal with it, this is overwhelming, this is too much for me, will experience it as a threat, and their blood pressure will go up. They'll go into a stress response. So if, when you're doing a kind of brain retraining or anything, and your response is, I'm getting it wrong, or I've got to get it right, and you're in threat, then all you're doing is further building the pathways into the stress response. And that needs to be addressed. Otherwise you can't get well, because you're just further building those things. So that's a big piece of it. The second thing you said was like finding time to do it in the day. With the lightning process, it's less about having a regime. It's more thinking about yourself in a different way, changing your internal conversations. And so it should fit very easily within your normal day. In fact, your day is an opportunity to start being nicer to yourself, start thinking about, okay, where am I pointing my brain? But it does take a bit of time, any training does. Sometimes it's easier for people who don't have full-time jobs, because they got a bit more downtime. But there's a whole set of things from the lightning process which we say it's going to be impossible to stop and jump around and all this stuff when you're in a business meeting. So yeah, there has to be another way to do it. So we talk people through the ways to deal with it neurologically and simply. So yeah, it sounds like there's some pieces when you were doing this, some pieces missing on how to make that work for you that doesn't just play back into some pathways that are keeping things stuck.
Well, I think ironically, when I let go of, like, this year, I kind of like let go of a lot of this need to do everything perfectly within brain retraining, and I just focused on gradually improving my exercise within a safe space, working on my sleep. I let go of the need to like be perfect in my diet and all of that, and this is when I've actually seen the most progression in my health. However, I think I'm starting to reach a little bit of a plateau where I have these crashes, and then I improve, crashes, improve, but I think there's still kind of, I need to make that go that extra mile. But one thing that I think is interesting about the lightning process, which has always kind of intrigued me, is the fact, and you talked about it, was you do it in person. Was that the case in COVID then, or were you doing?
So yeah, in COVID, we had to look, can we do it? Because we always said, let's do it in person. Because about maybe 20 years ago, I did it on Skype with someone and it just didn't quite work. And I thought, because being with someone is, and being able to really see and experience as much as you can of what's going on for them is an important part of it. And so I was cautious of doing it online. But when COVID struck, it was like, or when it was coming, it was like, okay, well, let's see. So we ran a little pilot project. Does it work with Zoom? And we do it on Zoom, because obviously Skype back in the day, 20 years ago, was like a tiny little grainy window, and it was very difficult to see much. Now with Zoom, both people are more familiar with it, and the technology is so much better. We did a trial, and it worked the same as we would expect it to work in real life, and that's been really interesting, because it's made it more available for people. And we always used to say to people, look, if you can't come and see a practitioner, they'll find a way to come to you, because we know, if you're ill and immobile, we work with people in darkened rooms and all this kind of stuff. But just reducing some of the stresses of getting to a seminar by having it on Zoom has been really helpful, and also has expanded the opportunity for countries where there weren't any practitioners, that people can get more access to it. So yeah, even though it's on Zoom, because of the quality of Zoom, like we're seeing today, the sense of all being in the room together is pretty cool, and it works very well.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because I do like the thought of the, I guess, live interaction with other people. How big are the groups normally?
Usually about 4 or 5 people. It's not huge. Also, interestingly, normally in groups, not in the lightning process, but most groups, they'll go, everybody has depression, everybody has this. In the lightning process, you have mixed groups. So people have different conditions, often different ages, have it for different times. And what's intriguing about it is when you get all those people together, you find that they have some different symptomatology, but there is also loads of stuff that's really they have in common that is central to why their body is not broken out of the illness. Because we have a lot of long COVID at the moment. It's a great example. I mean, how many millions of people around the world have COVID? Lots and lots and lots of them got well. And so how come some people who've had exactly the same infection as most people on the planet haven't? What's going on? Why is their body not recovered? Because it should do, statistically, most people recover. Why have they not? What's getting in the way of that natural recovery that everybody else seems to have? And they probably recovered from flu at some point. Like they've had a cut and it's got well. So what's going on here? What's interrupting that natural process of recovery that we usually trust and rely on? And when I was in my 20s, I had a post-viral thing. I had a horrible ear infection. It was just awful. If anyone's had it, you know what I'm talking about. And then finally, this thing exploded, and I felt better. But then for about 3 months, I could not get out of bed. That classic. I'm talking about. Yeah. And every morning you wake up like, "Am I better now?" Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. And tried everything. I was exhausted. And I hadn't invented the lightning process at that time, but I had some other skills. I managed to slowly get myself out, but I just remember that just bleak every day being like Groundhog Day, that thing. And so I do know a bit of what it's like to go through this, And I haven't had the long haul that some people have, but yeah, it's just awful. And finding a way through that is amazing, because that's the other thing we see, people kind of going, I can't believe it. I've just done a process this week with some people, and they were saying, the stuff I've done this week, I couldn't imagine doing it last week. Unbelievable.
Yeah. How would you? So the reason I created this podcast was when I first started getting symptoms like years ago. Whenever you typed in like Google, I don't even think YouTube was much of a thing back then, but like whenever you typed in Google, the symptoms or anything like that, you were always just met with like. Won't recover or
abandon all hope,
all of that kind of stuff. And and I've said it on the podcast a few times. I think Google should be paid to have recovery stories at the top of search, and same with YouTube and stuff as well. And I've always thought that the reason why I created this podcast was because I realised that there was actually a lot of recovery stories out there, but just either people didn't stick around to tell them or they just weren't really promoted that well. And this podcast was created so people could build their belief, so that they go into programs like yours with that belief already, the door's already kind of open a little bit. And I think that's what you kind of alluded to at the beginning when you said about, the 5 hours that they experience, because I imagine you need to open that door a little bit for them to step through it. How important is that belief going into the process?
I think it's super important. And not just, interestingly, not just in the lightning process. So I've done a few podcasts myself. The Mind-Body Connection podcast is an interesting one where I interview the key researchers who did the research on the Mind-Body Connection. So they're still around. We talk to them. And they're really interested when somebody's interested in their work. And I was talking to this professor called Andrea Avers, really, really well-established, incredibly well-funded, straight-edged, no woo-woo professor. And I said to her, out of all the studies you've done, she's done loads of kind of placebo studies, what's the most useful thing you'd like to share with anybody? And she said, if I had a friend who was going for an operation, and I talked to them and I said, how are you feeling about the operation? And the friend said, I'm not sure it's going to work. She said, my advice to my friend would be, do not have the operation.
Wow.
First, talk to your surgeon more. Find other success stories. Get your head focused on this is going to work before you have the operation. And what she's not saying is the operation won't work if you're not positive about it. But she's saying if you're positive about it and you have the operation, the chances of it working are huge. And this is based on research. And it turns out that everything, not just the lightning process, not just athletic ability, not just mental prowess, whatever it is, everything is affected. So the very first interview I do is with a guy called Irving Kirsch, who is a professor who started something called the response expectancy theory, which is all about this. It's the basis of how placebos works. What we think is going to happen happens. So in terms of our body, if we expect something, so if you give someone a blue pill, it will have a different effect from a yellow pill if they're Italian, because blue is, if you're an Italian man, is related to the Italian football team. If the room is warm when you get a pill, that will have an effect. If you trust the person who gives it to you, that will have an effect. It's just crazy how much of the mental space we're coming into when we have any medical intervention, educational intervention, any interview. Everything is affected by where is our head at the start. So the learning process is no different. Where your head is at the start is really important. And what you want to do is go, right, what is going to put me in the best place where I'm going to get most value from this? And that's what we spend a lot of time doing, is going, right, we know that everybody is affected by their expectations. So how can we help people to have the most useful expectations?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I always think that I kind of like, it's almost like I screw myself over a little bit, because it's almost like, I know that belief is like really important. So like, it's almost like you're double bluffing yourself. And yeah,
you kind of need to, what you need to do with the belief is you have to get enough evidence that convinces you, whatever that is. And for different people, sometimes you just need to see one. I've seen one story, I've heard one thing, I'm in. And other people, they have a convincer, which is I need to hear 20 stories and nothing negative, and that's fine. And that's what you have to do until you need to do that no matter what you're doing, whether you're going for the surgery, the lightning process, taking your pills. You want to get your mind, body, and everything aligned so that your journey is easy. That's the easiest journey you can make. If you imagine you're about to get married and somebody says, do you want to marry this person? You go, yeah, a little bit. It's like, let's probably don't go forward at that point. Pause, have a think about it. You really want to be like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. And health is probably equally important.
Yeah. It's interesting that, like, with the belief around like recovery, for me, I think in the beginning I believed it on an intellectual level, and then it's another thing like actually feeling it. And for me, it has taken. That's why I think it's taking me time, because I need to build that trust, and it's not just an overnight thing. And I think what does it is that you have these crashes, and then there's almost like this deep belief that there's something different about you that no one else has. And I've said it on a podcast a few times. I went to this Joe Dispenza retreat, and he said, don't think there's anything special about you that means that you won't be able to get this. And then when I think about it, and I think I do fully believe it now, that it's not as complicated as everyone thinks. And I think because we've given these long laundry lists of symptoms and conditions and everything that we've got, it makes us think that there's all this, really complex things going on, but it's actually a lot more simple than we let ourselves believe. So yeah.
I completely agree with both those things. I think there's a couple of levels to the belief. There's like it is possible to get well is one of the beliefs, but the second belief, what you alluded to, it is possible for me. Like I get they can get well, but what about me? And that's that special conversation. And we find that, so we reckon about a tiny percentage of people think this probably won't work for me. In reality, the chances of it not working for them is really small. And yet about 95% of people think they are in that 0.003% of people who don't get on with the process. So there's a kind of bias that people are throwing themselves into this piece of the pie that they really shouldn't all fit into, because it's not that common. So that idea of I'm different, well, in fact, the fact that everybody thinks they're different makes them all the same, really, because it's so common. Everybody thinks I'm different. So we had this guy. He said, "I want to come and see you because I've had a friend who's had exactly the same condition, got the same consultant. Everything we have is the same. I've got my main symptoms: fatigue, and tiredness all the time, particularly after exercise. He has a headache on the right-hand side of his head. He got rid of that. Trouble is, I'm not sure it'll work for me because I've got all those symptoms, but my headache's on the left-hand side. Like, what you're looking for, your identical twin, like nobody, no, I mean, you've talked to other people, I'm sure, with your condition. And the one thing you can all pinpoint is something that's different.
Yeah.
And that's fine, as long as you don't go, then if your regime worked for you, it probably won't work for me. Instead, what you want to do instead, we have so much in common. If it's worked for you, then why not me? That's a much more useful way of thinking about it. Moving out of the I'm different and going I'm the same. As long as the same thing is something positive, you don't want to go I'm the same because nothing works, but you want to go I'm the same because we have the same, there's so much we have in common. If you've made a change, then why not me? That's a much more useful space to come from.
Well, yeah, and I see such an interesting overview because I see people's comments on YouTube, people message me, and people are always like specific. Their question is always very specific to their diagnosis. And what is amazing about for me personally doing this podcast is that I take a lesson from anyone with any diagnosis, and I see us all going through exactly the same thing. Yeah, we're experiencing different symptoms, but mentally and what we need to get over in general, I'd say 98% of the time. I haven't done any work behind those stats. I'd say that's right. Like, we're all going through the same thing. We're just experiencing it through a different lens in terms of the symptoms. Do you find the chronic health space is full of people who have been burnt quite a lot in terms of in their mind, they've been burnt because they try things, it doesn't work, and trying things, it doesn't work. And I find it makes a lot of people very mistrusting and very, they think everyone's kind of out to get them and trying to sell them on this snake oil and stuff like that. And I find it, and I get it, I completely get it. But I also find it quite sad because I think people miss out on a lot of key lessons that they could get. I'm sure you deal with a lot with that, or I would assume so. Why do you think? How do you deal with people like that who've got really good intentions? They want to recover, but also they're very, let's say, traumatized by a lot of the stuff that's happened in the past. How do you help them overcome that?
Well, that I would say is a very common conversation because most people come to see us, like we were saying before we start recording, as a kind of relatively last resort. And in fact, a conversation you quite often have with people is, I've had my eye on the lightning process for a long time and I think it's going to work. But because I think that so much, I didn't want to do it now because it's, then if it didn't work, then that would be the worst thing. So I tried everything else first. So there's weird stuff like that going on, or understandably weird stuff. So often they've been through a lot of stuff and it clearly hasn't resulted in what they wanted. And so they're traumatized, they're experienced in failure and things not being delivered that they promise. The lightning process is quite different in that we don't say, we promise we will get you well. We don't say that. We say, we promise we will teach you the skills that other people have found useful. And we'll promise we'll do everything we can to help support you, put that into practice. But that's the only promise we can't make. We can't promise results because it's a training program. It's not a treatment. A bit like you with your personal trainer. He can say, look, I will turn up and I will teach you, but I'm not going to be lifting the weights for you. That's your job. Your strength training is going to come from the work you do. So it's together. And the other thing we say to people is, look, really don't come. We're not interested in having people on the course who are not likely to get value from it. It's not good for us. It's not good for them. So we say, look, so when people listen to the 5-hour thing before the course, before the seminar, we have a conversation and we have a chat through it. And I start the chat by saying, listen, the purpose of today is to kind of meet each other, introduce each other, get to know each other, but also really to decide together if this is the right thing for you. It may not be. And about 30% of the people I talk to, I say, look, I don't think this is the right thing for you right now. Maybe later, but not right now. And there's some more work you need to do because I don't want them to come along and be disappointed. I want them to come when they're super ready, so they've got the maximum chance of getting the changes that they want. So that's kind of how we do it. Instead of saying, come and take our magical training, it's like, it's not a magical training. It's a very, sound, research-based, practical thing. But you're going to need to be in a certain space for it. And if you're not, it's probably not the right thing for you, And I think that's the right way to approach it. And I think when you try and sell someone something and it's not a good fit, it's never going to work. So that's where we come from.
Do you have like success rates? I think people are quite cautious about saying success rates because then you're held to something, and I totally get that. But do you have like because you mentioned you survey?
Yeah, we did this big study some time ago now. I have to look up the exact numbers. So, but it's over 1,200 and something people. And then we said out of 10 where you got the changes you want, a certain percentage, I think it's, again, I'd have to look this up, but I think it's 85% of people, it may be 95, but it's high, said between 8, 9 and 10 was their score in terms of the results they got. That's a survey, okay? More compelling is the randomized controlled trial. So in research, you really want to compare something with something else and go, right, we're going to take this group of people, we're going to randomly put them into either treatment A or treatment B. They don't have a choice, so they're just thrown into those treatments, and then we'll see at the end is their result. That's your randomized controlled trial. And that's considered to be a gold standard in research, gives you the best kind of take on the data. So they did a randomized controlled trial in University of Bristol, Bristol and the Bath hospitals of adolescents with mild to moderate CFS. That means they could actually make it. They were considered to be excluded if they couldn't even make it to the session. And they found that when they in this case, they applied what's called specialist medical care, which was the best thing the NHS could provide for these kids. Then they had specialist medical care plus lightning process. So that's what they were comparing. And what they found was that when they added lightning process to what they normally did, the results were what's called statistically significant, which means this was more than chance. This was as a result of the intervention on every level. So that was reduction in fatigue, reduction in pain, reduction in depression, anxiety, more days at school, and all sorts of other measures. And that they did 2 different tests, but they said it suggested it was cost effective for the NHS. And that was published in a side journal of the BMJ. And there's also been a systematic review that I was involved in, part of a team of researchers, collecting all the data together. And all the studies say the lightning process produces positive outcomes for the majority of people. So the research is pretty good. Now, the problem with research is that's about general populations. How does that relate to you, the individual? And all it does, it gives you a guide. It says, well, look, it looks like this thing works pretty well. Then we need to kind of go, well, what are the factors that seem to make a difference? And like we talked about today, one of the factors is getting your head around, this is possible. Recovery is possible, like you're saying on your podcast. The techniques make sense to me. The mind, brain, body connection. Other people with similar kind of conditions to me seem to have got well. Other people with similar background, age, whatever the thing is that makes you think I can connect with these people. Once you've done all that, your kind of due diligence, talk to the practitioner, listen to the stuff, then you can think, okay, maybe this is something that will work for me. But you kind of need to go through all that. You don't want to just jump in, without having done that prep, because then you may find, this isn't what I wanted to do.
Yeah. I first heard about the lightning process very much in tandem with chronic fatigue. It felt like it was very linked with chronic fatigue, and I feel like maybe a lot of the Gupta as well. I felt like that, and then when I actually looked into it, it was a whole range of conditions, and it's going back to what we said before about people putting things in a bucket of like, oh, this is only chronic fatigue, it'll only work for chronic fatigue. Are there any chronic conditions that you guys think that you haven't had success with, or will you look at anything that's chronic?
Well, I think we'll probably look at anything, but so for instance, when people came with MS, multiple sclerosis, which is a destruction of the insulating sheaths on the nervous system, it's often actually, interestingly, misdiagnosed with chronic fatigue, and vice versa. People can often get one diagnosis or the other. When people came and said, "Can you help us?" We have no idea, but we'd be interested to find out. And then the thought was, okay, I mean, the thing about MS that's particularly interesting is that people can have the damage, which is of these myelin sheaths, which can cause incontinence, inability to walk, blindness, a whole range of neurological symptoms. And then in certain versions of the illness, the symptoms can completely go, absolutely go, for weeks, months, years, decades. But when you look at their nerves, you'll still see the damage. So it's a really interesting condition. You've got this physical damage, but the symptoms are variable. And we work with other neurological conditions. So we thought, well, there's good reason to have a go. And we did a study with an MS charity, and the results are very promising. So that's kind of how we do it. We don't say, oh yeah, we can fix this. We're like, let's have a look. Does this make any sense? Why that would work? And then we don't kind of make any claims for it until we've seen quite a lot. And we say, and even then we're very cautious. We don't say, yes, we can fix this. We say, look, here's a list of some people, have a chat with them. Here's some videos of people who've had the same thing, they've got well. If this makes sense to you, we can have a look and see what changes you can make.
Have you ever had any experience with people with Crohn's?
Yeah.
And has that been positive?
Yeah. Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and other inflammatory bowel diseases. We've had people go through the process who've got rid of it, who've gone back to non-symptomatic gut function. Is that true of every case? No, not at all, because people are different. Quite often, people will come with this condition. I've got fatigue issues. I've also got Crohn's, or I've also got ulcerative colitis. And they'll work with the thing they come with, and then they'll find that's also the other thing has gone at the same time. Because if we look at inflammatory bowel disease like this, fundamentally it's being run by the immune system. The immune system is not functioning properly, and that it's attacking itself, and that's what produces a lot of the ulceration, a lot of the destruction of the tissues, the inflammation in the gut. If you can find a way to get the immune system, I mean, that's what steroids do. When people take steroids, what it's doing is settling the immune system down so it's not being so overactive. If we can find a way to settle that down, and we know the immune system is massively affected by the stress response and the sympathetic nervous system, if you can settle that down, you've got a chance of getting things back to normal, particularly with the gut. And the reason that is that the turnover rate of cells within the gut is very fast. Like the skin, it's one of the areas that comes into contact with the outside world, although it's inside of us, it's the food from the outside world. And so the cell turnover is very fast. So as a result, there's constantly new cells being grown. If you can get some kind of rebalance in that system, both in terms of getting the immune system working and also the digestive system working, because again, we know when people get into threat and stress, it affects their digestion. So you get a double whammy of your immune system not functioning properly and your digestion system not moving and working properly. If you can get that settled, it gives the body a chance to do some healing.
Yeah, I've had people on the podcast actually who have got better with Crohn's, but I think a lot of the time it involved medication. It's just I know someone with Crohn's actually, and is going through a tough time. So
yeah, it's an awful thing to go through. Really.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'll point him. Yeah, maybe we'll talk afterwards. But if you have any success stories, you can send my way. That would be excellent. Maybe we could have them on the podcast. My final or two more questions. If someone's really struggling with like motivation because progress is, let's say, because I think sometimes people are progressing, but they're progressing really slowly. And it's difficult for them to see the progress over time, or maybe it's just they're not progressing at all. How would you suggest for them to keep up the motivation in kind of keep moving forward?
If you're feeling like you're struggling or stuck, then and sometimes with the lightning process, where we do well and then they don't use it, or something comes up, or something new happens, or a new symptom. then we always say, get in touch with a practitioner. That's what they're there for. They're there for you for the long haul, to help you whenever you need. And that happens. Occasionally I see people I haven't seen for 20 years and they go, oh, can you help me with this? I've just had COVID and I can't go over it. So sometimes it's that. But let's say somebody hasn't done the lightning process and they're just struggling. I would say, watch podcasts like this, listen to stories, really fill your world with a different conversation about me. Think about me and my nerve. Everybody was saying you will never recover. An important part of me recovering was remembering it was even bloody possible, that it was even a potential for that. So I sought out and, found things that made me go, well, this is possible, because this is where the internet can be your friend or your enemy. If you go on the internet, you can end up in a whole stream of, as I'm sure everyone knows, of negative, symptom-based, hopeless, bloody conversation. Or if you curate your internet habit and find inspirational stories, genuine people, who doesn't always have to be like easy, but they got there, then that I think is really valuable. And unfortunately, whichever stream you listen to will become part of your internal narrative that will affect your health. And so people who, I'm sure you've seen this, people get stuck on those forums, those groups, they talk about problems all the time, rarely get better.
Yeah.
And there is actually some research into this, that connecting with certain types of support group increase your doubtfulness and skepticalness of recovery and therapeutic approaches. No, not all forums are bad, but be selective about who you hang out with and what conversations you get in touch with, I think.
Yeah, I've said on the podcast a number of times on Instagram, it's actually quite sad that the accounts that, let's say, wallow and dwell on being in chronic illness get an incredible amount of engagement, because people are just drawn to that negativity and they want to vent. And I get it. I totally get it. But then the ones that are like really trying to promote the fact that you can get better really don't do too well. And yeah, it's really interesting. I used to be going these Facebook groups in the beginning of before Instagram was like kind of really much of a thing. And I spent quite a lot of time in there. I wouldn't ever vent and stuff, but it's just people, the desperation is just, palpable, and everyone's just sharing it and feeding off it. And it's just not a good place.
Yeah, and you can see why. It's like they feel that nobody understands. This is somewhere they get understood, and that's a useful part of that journey. But you don't want to get parked in there, because that's the only conversation you're feeding on. And the other thing I often say to people when they do the lightning process is, not only decide where you're going to go on the internet, but check what your social media handles are, because some people's names are like fatigued Fiona and tired Tom, and then they're seeing that every day, and that's their identity. It's like, come on, guys, that's really not helpful.
Yeah.
And you can see again why they've done it is to kind of state, this is an important part of my life and I want people to recognize it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you can also see how that feeds into some of the stuck neurology you don't want to be jumping into.
I was very deliberate with the naming of this podcast, because having chronic in there was something that was like, oh, that is quite triggering in itself. But having come back straight after it it negates that, that negative connotation. And yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you really don't want to build an identity around it. And like I've talked about it a lot. And actually, you said it at the beginning, language is just so important. And even saying the words like, when I got sick, when I got ill, it's building into that. So yeah, it's really interesting that you reference that on Instagram. You see a lot of it, unfortunately. Final question. Some people who are listening to this right now, a lot of them will be at their kind of in their darkest hours, or just in the thick of it, really. What would be your advice to them, just in order for them to keep going and build this belief that they can get better? They're not, that there's not something unique about them that means that they won't recover. What would be your advice to them?
So I think you really just said it. So in our experience, and I've been working in this field for decades. I'm probably one of the people who's been working it for the longest time. Since the lightning process, which is nearly 25 years old now, we've seen over 25,000 people, and we actually have a little picture of what 25,000 people look like, and it's like I think it's Centre Court, Wimbledon, or Australian Open or something. It's like it's a big chunk of people, and it's not just those people; it's their kids, their partners, their parents' lives are completely transformed, and in that 25,000 plus people, there are people who are as young as 6 or 7 who've done the lightning process. There are people who are holding down full-time jobs and have done the lightning process. There are people who have part-time jobs who've done the lightning process. There are people who are bedbound, done the lightning process. People living in darkened rooms being fed tubes through their nose for food who've done the lightning process and climbed mountains. There are people up to 80-something who've done the lightning process. If all those people can make change, then so can you. I absolutely believe that, and it doesn't have to be through the lightning process. That's kind of irrelevant. It's like, if those people can do that program or that program and get change, and they definitely have this, not everybody's lying out there, people did get a change, then ask yourself, then why not me? Don't ask yourself, how am I different? Ask yourself, if they can do it, then why not me? And start there. And that is such an important part of that journey. And coming back to my story, my story was, this hand thing. I was like, there has to be a way. There has to be a way. And then when I found other people who'd got out too, it was like, there is a way. Then I've got to ask myself, what is my way? How do I find my way? Who do I get on board? Who do I call up? Who do I have as cheerleaders? What do I need to do? And also, I think the other thing, and you talked about this earlier, let go of the idea it has to be complicated. It doesn't. It really doesn't. That is another belief that we have that is born out of, we've tried stuff and it hasn't worked. The analogy we have is like, if you try and hammer a nail into a wall, right, using a banana, it will seem like an impossible job. Get a hammer. It's a few seconds. So when you find the right tool for you, why should it not be easy?
Perfect. Thank you very much. I know, well, particularly that last bit of advice, I know people will take a lot from it. Thank you for bearing with me whilst I've sniffed and sneezed my way through this episode. I think I'm about to again now. If people want to reach out to you or reach out to the guys on your team or just ask more questions, what's the best way of them doing that?
So if they go to, there's a number of websites. There's Lightning Process with no E, lightningprocess.com, or philparker.org.
Yep.
And the best way to get hold of me is send me an email, phil@philparker.org.
Brilliant.
And me or my team will get back to you, and do, we really, our role, like you, is to help. We just want to help people get well. We know it's possible. We've seen too many lives that have been put on hold for years because people didn't know that there was a solution out there. They've been told that you can never get well, when actually people were getting well next door and they didn't know about it. And for me, that is something that needs to change. It's so important. This information is available, so then you can make a choice. If you don't even know it exists, you can't make a choice. We need to open up these conversations, and that's why I really value what you're doing, Phil, here. In opening up these conversations, so people get a bit of chink of light and go, okay, right, no, there is a glimpse of something. I'm going to have a look over there, and that is such an important part of this journey.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to get this out there. So I appreciate you doing it at the very beginning of your Friday.
Good to see you, Phil. Nice to meet you.
Cheers.